This video contains a text-to-speech voice. This allows me to make videos easier and faster than with my real voice. If I were to ask you to name a famous ship, what would your answer be? It would likely vary, but if you were a ship enthusiast like me, you would probably name 20 or more ships. One of the ships on my list was the Normandie, arguably one of the best ocean liners in history. For centuries, the transatlantic service was a huge source of income, as immigrants left Europe for the New World. Shipping companies would always one-up each other with their quote-unquote greatest ship in the world. The French company, Compagnie Générale Transatlantique, also known as the French Line, never had any significant ships, whereas some of the best ships they had to offer were either SS Paris or Île-de-France. These two were not the largest nor the fastest, but they were a sign of French elegance. While there was nothing wrong with them, they were easily outmatched by their competitors. After the First World War, immigration to the U.S. increased significantly, mainly to escape the heavily damaged Europe. However, it actually started to become a problem when large numbers of immigrants started flooding to the U.S., limiting food and employment for the naturally born citizens. The U.S. Immigration Act of 1924 was developed and approved to fix these problems. This act heavily restricted the number of immigrants allowed into the U.S., which obviously affected the transatlantic service. Desperate on fixing the decreasing source of income, many companies began to throw around the idea of tourism. During that time, tourism was something that was accommodated around the wealthy, and not everyone could afford to travel just for the fun of it, so accommodations of the different classes aboard ships had to change. In the late 20s, Germany introduced Bremen in Europa, which took tourism into effect with a brand new, more sleek ship design, while other companies were still trying to figure out what to do. Since newer ships are now focusing on tourism and passengers could now travel for the fun of it, all whilst on a budget, along with the prohibition of alcohol in the US, Americans were often seeking a good drink, allowing for the perfect opportunity for the French line to create their very own Superliner. Normandie was designed by a man named Vladimir Yorkovich, who designed a few various warships back in Russia, many of them remarkable due to their streamlined hulls, allowing them to move more efficiently in the water. Yorkovich would eventually relocate to France and would receive the opportunity to design a massive ocean liner for the French line. Many designs were proposed for the new ship, with over 24 models being used to test the different designs. Yorkovich's model used his streamlined design proven successful back in Russia, and of course, his model performed with outstanding results. His design would obviously be selected for the new liner. Construction began in January 1931 at Chantiers de Pinhet and was launched in October 1932. Normandie would finally be completed in early 1935, and she came at a length of 1,030 feet, a beam of nearly 120 feet, and a draft of about 36 feet. She also had a displacement of about 68,000 tons and an internal volume of 80,000 gross registered tons. France now had the largest ship in the world, where the previous holder of that title was the former German superliner Bismarck, renamed Majestic. Her funnel casings were split and ran up the sides of the ship instead of up through the center, similar to the former German superliners. This allowed Normandie to have massive public rooms for her passengers to enjoy. Her third funnel wasn't connected to the boiler room and was likely used for ventilation for the engine room. After completion, she went to perform her sea trials, which were tests used to determine if a ship is seaworthy or not, among other things. Normandie passed her trials without issue, and she managed to reach a top speed of 32 knots due to Yorkovich's hull design. Normandie could cut through the water with little resistance. The French line would finally receive Normandie, and she would leave for her maiden voyage in May 1935. She took the Le Havre, Southampton, New York route. She even managed to steal the Blue Ribbon, which was the title a ship carried for the fastest Atlantic crossing. Since immigration was no longer the main source of income, the French line focused more towards tourism, and this allowed a revamp to Normandie's intended three-class system. Normandie still carried passengers among three classes, whereas first class was renamed to cabin class, designated for the wealthiest amongst society, while second class was renamed to tourist class, a downgraded, more affordable variant of cabin class. Compared to second class amongst other liners, tourist class was more varied in a range from comfortable to luxurious. This was a class designed for those wanting to go on a nice vacation without the cost of an arm and a leg. The French line didn't rule out immigration entirely, as a small third class was inserted into the ship. Third class had simple but still nice interiors, seemingly designed to those on a tight budget, like how you're going on a vacation that dad didn't want to pay for and was 100% mom's idea to begin with. Normandie had a capacity of 1,972 passengers, with 848 in cabin class, 670 in tourist, and 454 in third. She also carried 1,345 crew, bringing the capacity to 3,317 people maximum per voyage. Normandie had a mostly uneventful career. She often rivaled Cunard White Star's Queen Mary for the blue ribbon, where Normandie would either lose or gain back the title until Queen Mary took it from her for good. Normandie was luxurious, and for some, it was too much. Many complained that Normandie was too luxurious, and that the vast division and variation complexity of her interior work caused some to lack familiarity and made the ship feel alien to some. Normandie's interiors can be best described as too busy, and was too much for some to take in. Passengers who traveled on Normandie preferred the familiar, more traditional styles of other ships, like Queen Mary. Unclear if tourist class would be solely profitable, Normandie's passenger capacity focused more towards her cabin class, but this would end up becoming a mistake as her interiors gave the impression that she was meant for the wealthy, so she would often be picked over by her rivals, so she would often sail about 2/3 her maximum capacity. Not to mention the fact that Normandie was completed in the middle of the Great Depression, and it made some think that her entire existence was just a giant FU to those in poverty. Normandie was planned to have a sister ship, but an identical sister ship would have been a challenge to improve off of Normandie's existing design, so an entirely new, yet similar design to Normandie would be drafted. The new ship would function as a running mate with a few key major differences to allow flexibility in sudden design changes learned from Normandie. Yorkovich got to work and designed a larger, more sleeker version of Normandie, with the main difference was that the new ship would have one forward funnel, and her vent uptakes would split up past the funnel, so the ship would use two side-mounted funnels forward, giving her a questionable look. This time Yorkovich's design would not be chosen, favoring the more traditional design based off of Normandie. The new ship would be named Britannia and would have been larger than Normandie, and would have housed two funnels instead of three. Her exact dimensions are unknown, and for whatever reason, Britannia would not be constructed, likely being delayed then cancelled during the Second World War. Normandie was docked in New York when the Second World War broke out. Returning through hostile waters back to France was a dangerous and idiotic idea, and since the U.S. would remain neutral, remembering the events of the previous World War, staying put in New York temporarily seemed to be the smart choice. However, in December 1941, America would enter the Second World War after Japan bombed Pearl Harbor. Normandie was seized by the U.S. government and was planned to be converted into a troopship, but since Normandie sounded too French to be an American warship, they changed her name to Lafayette. USS Lafayette would finally begin her conversion several days later, and all the luxurious interiors would have to be removed. On February 9, 1942, conversion was going as planned until the sparks from a welding torch ignited some of the life vests stored in the lounge. Most of the lounge's interiors weren't removed yet, allowing the fire to spread rapidly throughout the space. The former Normandie was designed with fire hoses installed throughout the ship, but for whatever reason, her pumps were deactivated during the conversion. Fire boats arrived on the scene and began to discharge water onto the ship. As hundreds of gallons of water were dumped onto Lafayette, the new imbalance of weight caused her to list to port. Coincidentally, Vladimir Yorkovich so happened to be in New York during the time of the incident and immediately rushed to the scene. Yorkovich knew the ship better than anyone, and he ordered the ship to flood completely, allowing her to sit at shallow depths of the harbor on an even keel, completely eliminating the risk of capsize. However, Yorkovich was turned away, allegedly being told that the professionals knew what they were doing. Lafayette began to list further to port and was at the risk of capsizing. In the early morning of February 10, Lafayette would finally capsize, and she sank into the mud of the New York harbor. The ship sat there until August 1943, when she would finally be righted after her superstructure and funnels were removed in order to reduce weight. The hull of the former Normandie would sit in dry dock with the decision remaining on what to do with her. Considering the hull's length, a few plans were drawn up to convert Lafayette into a carrier, but the excessive amount of damage done made it impossible for conversion of any kind. In 1945, the Second World War ended, and the U.S. Navy had lost interest in using the hull. Vladimir Yorkovich had considered completely dismantling the ship and reuse her parts for a much smaller liner to replace Normandie, but nothing came of it, and in October the following year, the hull was broken up. The French line would receive minimum compensation with the former German liner Europa, which was renamed Liberté. This ship did not match any quality Normandie once held under the French line, but they took what they could get. Normandie was truly a phenomenal liner, and she proved to be one of the best of her time. Unfortunately, her career was cut short due to mismanagement and incompetence while under conversion into a troopship. If she survived the war, Normandie would have returned as a public favorite and would have likely done some cruising in the 60s. Unfortunately, she would never receive the opportunity to prove how magnificent of a ship she truly was.